In Climate Watch today, diplomats from nearly 200 countries have reached a major agreement to keep the 2015 Paris Accord alive. Officials wrapped up a global summit in Poland over the weekend after 2 weeks of talks and years of negotiations.
They established a set of rules to tackle climate change in each country. The U.S. agreed to the deal despite President Trump promising to withdraw from the Paris Pact. Axios energy and climate reporter Amy Harder was there for the summit in Poland, and she's joining us now from Washington. So let us dig into this, Amy. What exactly did this conference accomplish, and was it enough when it comes to fighting climate change?
Well, thanks for having me. This conference, which happens every year in different cities around the world, was all about the details of the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. So what ended up coming out as the actual results of the conference were pretty wonky, dealing with things like transparency of reporting greenhouse gas emissions and things that are incredibly important, but that don't necessarily make the headlines that we've seen in the past about the actual deal. But the fact that they got to agreement on some of those details is really important, considering the overall political climate around the world is less than promising from a climate change perspective.
You know, Amy, I'm unclear as to the messaging here from the United States. The president has withdrawn the United States from the 2015 Paris Accord, but America had a role at the summit. What was that role, and what were they trying to accomplish?
Yeah, it is a little confusing, even for those of us on the ground. I just got back last night. The best way to describe it is that the U.S. administration is really on a two-track process. They have the career diplomats that are in the room negotiating on things like transparency and ensuring countries like China are committing to transparency and details like that. And then you have the political appointees from the White House and the Environmental Protection Agency who held an event earlier last week touting the benefits of fossil fuels and nuclear power. And so you really have this two parallel tracks, and they don't really interact all that much. But because the U.S. is actually in the Paris climate deal until at least 2020, you still have those diplomats on the ground negotiating it.
So then in the middle of this summit, the UN drops this climate change report, and it's pretty dire. Did it have an impact on negotiations?
It definitely had an impact on the narrative of the two-week conference. This report from a UN science panel underscored how difficult it is going to be to reduce emissions to the levels that scientists say that we must. One sort of wonky but important kerfuffle is the best way to describe it, that occurred was last weekend when the United States joined with Russia and Saudi Arabia to resist wording to welcome the report as opposed to note it. And it seems really wonky and detailed, but it's incredibly important when it comes to diplomatic negotiations like this. So ultimately, the compromise was to welcome the fact that the report was issued, but not welcome its findings.
So, Amy, you have reported on this, and it's been reported elsewhere here at this network and other news organizations about how dire the future is when it comes to this planet in terms of what is happening with regards to climate change. Are the issues that were addressed at this summit anyway going to stave off some of the worries that a lot of people see coming?
I would say the short answer is no, not at all. The purpose of this but then again, that was never really the purpose of this conference. The purpose was to lay out the rule book of the 2015 Paris deal. Even the Paris deal, though, doesn't reduce emissions anywhere near what the scientists say we must. It simply slows the growth of emissions. So the next big thing that I'm watching, and others are, is this very big summit that the United Nations Secretary General is hosting in New York in September. The last time he did this was in 2014. So, you know, the UN and others are doing what they can, but at a certain point, you can't expect to just hold more conferences to get more ambition. You really have to change the energy policies in different countries. And we're seeing outside of the bubble that is these climate talks, you're seeing that is very difficult. France saw a lot of violent protests over, among other things, higher fuel costs because of taxes. So I think it's going to be very difficult when push comes to shove to institute policies that will make energy more expensive. I think that's going to be very difficult, and I tend to think another conference won't achieve that.
The question I guess that I have is, you know, when climate change is reported and climate change is talked about, whether it's in the media or elsewhere, generally people don't seem to connect what's happening with the climate to real-life consequences for human beings on this earth. In terms, we're looking at this refugee crisis that's happening at the southern border, and rising temperatures means more and more people will be displaced. We're going to see an explosion. That's just one aspect of what we're talking about with climate. Just one point that as food gets scarce, more and more people are going to look for food sources, and they're going to come to places that have better food sources and opportunities and cleaner water. And is that being discussed at all?
That is certainly, and you're seeing that more and more, the tangible impacts of a warmer planet and the way it has not just on extreme weather, but things like the refugee crisis. I've often described climate change as diabetes for the planet. So it makes existing conditions worse. So refugees have always existed for different reasons, and now climate change is making that worse. I think it's going to be difficult to, number one, acknowledge that in order to address climate change, you need to make fossil fuels more expensive. And there appears to be this disconnect between that reality and what countries are willing to put on the table at conferences like this one in Poland.
And this entire discussion being hosted by a country that makes its bread and butter from coal.
That's right.
That is, it was there sort of trying to influence and pressure people to keep coal as a viable alternative. Amy Harder, thank you so much.
Thank you.